If you like, sort of note card, pencil, and one of the dot sheets, and pass it around. Okay. It's so good to be here in this shady, lovely place. How long till abolition? Seasons of change. Before I get into it, I'm going to introduce myself, adding a little bit more context from what Tao said. My name, as said, is Chloe Cockburn. I come from a family of sort of radical journalists. We have some books here from my grandfather, who was a communist, card-carrying communist, and wrote for decades around politics in England, Ireland, and internationally. My mother, Leslie Cockburn, this is Out of Control, about the war on drugs. My dad, Andrew Cockburn, who's written a lot on military history and many other things. And my uncle, Alexander Whiteout, this is another book about the war on drugs, which will be a theme later. My dad is from Ireland, and that's a picture that I took there, and I share it because that also heavily shapes my politics. You know, when you're in this work and you meet organizers and they're like, why are you doing this? You know, what's your connection to the issue? And you have to have a good answer to that, especially, you know, being a white woman, elite educated, like, what am I doing messing around with mass incarceration? And I really root that in my Irish history, radical politics, anti-oppressive politics. And it's a place I go back to every year and I reground myself. As Tao said, I went to Harvard Law School. I worked at various places after that, including the ACLU. Then in 2015 came to a place called Open Philanthropy to work for Dustin Moskovitz, who's a co-founder of Facebook, and his wife, Cari, Tuna, giving away millions and millions and millions of dollars, not enough millions, but a lot of millions, to end mass incarceration. I worked there for 6 years and gave about $150 million away for them and some tens of millions for other people. Really satisfying work to get to put money on the ground to make big change. And then in 2022, I founded a thing called Just Impact, which I now run, which raises and gives away money and advises donors, well, super wealthy people, on how to dismantle mass incarceration, which you might think is a little bit of a contradiction. How does capital, which is in a way founded on the prison, want to undo the prison? That's a question someone very astute put to me recently within 1 minute of me meeting him. And that is the point, and that is a challenge. It's hard to raise money to tear down the master's house, as they say. But that's a little situation on me. So I'm going to share 3 chapters today that will, might seem a bit of a jump from each to each, but I'll hopefully integrate them for you in the end. Chapter 1, what drives mass incarceration? A whirlwind tour. Chapter 2, seasons of leadership and movements. And chapter 3, how long till abolition? So bear with me and hopefully learn something cool. Okay, mass incarceration. If you can see the screen, you just see like colors. What is all this stuff? You probably can't even parse what it is, but it's mass incarceration is a vast systemic problem. If you can see this tiny little chart here, there's a huge bump starting in the early 70s. This is how many people were in prison in the US before. Not so many, still too many, but not so many. And then it's like, whoa, giant, enormous growth in the number of people in prison. At the bottom here, you have dozens of countries in the world. These gray ones are US states. The vast majority of US states have more people per 100,000 incarcerated than any other country. And then you start to get, there's like El Salvador in here and stuff like that. Germany, Norway, any other kind of major industrialized country is way down there. It's a cyclical problem, it reproduces itself. And I have to tell you about this one down here. There's more people with arrest records in the United States, or about the same as people with a bachelor's degree. And more people with arrest records that voted for Obama in 2012 than people who are married, that are military veterans and so on. It's huge. Okay, it's also really expensive. The government, state, local, and federal government spend about $300 billion a year on this, creating something like $900 billion of cost to the people directly impacted in terms of fines and fees and lost wages and family destruction and all of the sort of calculable costs. And then there are, of course, many, many incalculable costs. So if it's so expensive and so destructive, why aren't we stopping it? What's going on here? So I'm going to briefly array for you 3 different types of causes that I think people kind of sort of land on for what is driving mass incarceration. And oftentimes people tend to stick with just one. You might say social causes, poverty, lack of education. A huge percentage of people in prison are illiterate. All of these, like, if we could only get people jobs, if we could only get people in education, then we'd solve this problem. Spoiler, I disagree, but that is a major driver. of one kind. Technical drivers, meaning the laws on the books, the statutes, things like that. There's like a sort of a heavy kind of legislative debt over the decades that can be hard to undo. But I think both of these are secondary causes, and the root cause is down here in the politics. The politicized lawmaking, the centuries, well, I guess we are getting on centuries now in the US, of this sort of political incentive and imperative to continue to do mass incarceration. And that's what we're going to focus on now. So this is a not all the way loaded picture of Angola, a former plantation, now prison in Louisiana. These are prisoners who are picking cotton, supervised by a corrections officer on a horse who, I don't think you can see his gun, but he does have a rifle. So that's Angola, that's happening right now today. And it's a particularly evocative picture sort of showing the sort of legacies that are driving this. But I'm gonna go to something more specific here. Under Nixon, which is when the big bump really started, the war on drugs got going, people look back and they think about drug policy. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people here have very radical and progressive views on drug policy, so this may be obvious. But people may assume it's tough, you want to solve this social problem, and it has these unintended consequences of incarcerating a lot of people in very racially discriminatory ways. But we have this quote from John Ehrlichman, who is Nixon's policy director, I'll read to you. This was said on the record to a journalist. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
Wow.
So was the drug war an authentic response to the social problem of many people using drugs? No, it was not. Why the drug war? Politics. So this is something more recent. This is a chart of mentions of crime in the first 6 months, or relative to the first, it's like from 2023. Mentions of crime in the media. We have Fox News here, MSNBC, and CNN. And all you need to notice about this chart is around September, mentions of crime go up on Fox, and the others follow, and then it spikes in November, right after the election. Point being that there's this sort of intense frenzy of fear-mongering and fear-making around crime. It's happening, it's everywhere, it's coming to get you. Right before the election, then after, they're moving on to the next thing. Because the point of it is not any kind of authentic relationship to a social problem, but is to create a political condition. And so we have things like elected judges being more punitive just before elections. We have police unions playing heavily in elections. We have, this is Tucker angrily talking about crime. And we have, I don't know if you've heard about retail theft. Major retailers actually admitted that they had sort of lied about retail theft to cover their bad business decisions. But what is left in the culture is people having a sense of this kind of oppressive, prevalence of crime. So it's nothing to do with solving the actual problem. It's to solve a political problem. So how do we tackle this? There's $300 billion a year pressing it. Fox News and, everyone from Nixon to Trump are sort of pressing this issue, creating this notion of crime, creating the notion that we must have more and more prisons. It seems kind of daunting to take it on. But before I give an answer to that, how we actually can go about tackling that, I want to ask a question to the room. How many of you, if you can recall, sort of thought about this issue? Well, how many of you have thought about this issue before today? Okay, how many thought about it before 2020, if you can remember? Before 2014? Okay, that works for my purposes. It's fewer as you go back in time. The reason I mentioned 2020, of course, is because it was the largest series of protests in American history. This is in Philadelphia, one of the many George Floyd protests. And there erupted this wave, unprecedented in the country, of millions, in fact 25 million people going to the streets to protest the killing of unarmed black men. Now let me ask, how many of you felt, if you can recall, it was a big year, sort of surprised at the time at this kind of out of nowhere eruption of people coming out into the streets? Surprised? somewhat surprised. We'll get to that in discussion. Anyway, so the thing that I'm going to propose to you is that what happened in 2020 is that summer came. The opposite of winter came for House Frey. Summer came for this issue in America. And in order to explain what I mean by that, I have to come to chapter 2, which is the seasons. So hold what I said about mass incarceration in your mind, because we're going to bring it back in chapter 3, but for now, pause on that. I'm going to run through this concept of the seasons with you. And this material comes from, gosh, that's annoying, this team of sort of wonderful theorists and historians of a kind, social movement historians, Carlos Saavedra and Paul Engler with the Cari Institute. And Carlos in particular has been really focused on the seasons. A number of the slides I'm going to use are from Carlos. We collaborate together all the time and present on this material, so it's with permission, but Carlos Saavedra, Cari Institute, and they also have trainings online that explain this material more deeply if you're interested, ineschool.com. Okay. And did the papers go around? Are they still going around? Dots and pencils and things like that? So keep passing them if they got stuck. Okay, so seasons. The idea of this sort of framework or metaphor is that we all go through seasons on the individual level, organizational level, and movement level, and from winter to winter, or spring to spring, if you like, with different kind of lengths of time, on the individual level, sort of shorter cycle, all the way up to movement cycles being much longer. So what are the seasons? The spring season is a time of awakening, of breaking open, of new growth and new possibility. It's still a hungry time because you haven't had your harvest yet, but you're coming out of winter and there's a sense that things could change in a good way. The summer is very externally focused, high energy. You have to be out and cultivating your land. There's a lot of things growing. The animals are abuzz, all of that stuff. It's real, and if it's a good summer, there's good heat. In the fall, you have a transition, a breaking down. Things start to disintegrate, but also hopefully a good harvest if you had a good summer. And in the winter, it's this kind of cold, this cold, quieter, more internally focused time. Coming back then to a new spring. Okay, so that's cool. Why do we need to talk about it now? This seasons helps us, in a way, assess challenges that we may run into as individuals, organizations, and movements as we move about the world. One of these challenges being the endless summer in capitalism that's always demanding that we be producing and externally focused and making a lot of stuff happen all of the time without any kind of break or transition or different modes. Summer, 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 all of the time. We also then conversely get what Carlos calls winter phobia. If we feel that we're in a winter, it's like bad. Oh no, things aren't moving as easily. I'm feeling like I can't relate to other people, or the people aren't caring about my issues. That can be sort of stressful and hard. So we want the winter to go away. We never want to undergo a winter. We also, in an associated way, have this pain of misalignment where this is showing a sort of green shoot that's covered in snow. This plant is trying to grow, but at the wrong time. It's like going out, for a jog in a snowstorm. It's not the right time to do that kind of thing. So those are the kind of negative aspects at a very high level of how you can imagine relating to the seasons. But there could be a positive aspect. In winter, this is a picture of a very cozy, warm, living room with a nice toasty fire with the winter outside. This is a good way to spend the winter, sort of relaxing, resting, reflecting, and kind of thinking about what you might grow out there after the snow melts away. As well, in the summer, if you're doing it properly, that's a good time to be thinking about what you harvest, growing and tending to your plentiful potential harvest for the fall. Okay, so movements also go through seasons. I've been speaking in a way kind of more oriented towards individuals. Movements go through seasons, and I hope you can sort of see this chart. This is winter, and it says creating the right soil. There's not many believers. There's a disempowered group of people, and they're just like, we want to get people to care about this, but my issue isn't moving. Spring, it starts to take off. More and more people coming in, more organizations coming on board. It feels like things can start happening. And as you get into the late spring and into the summer, that's when, for this particular cycle, not all of which are of equal intensity, you're going to get your maximum sort of participation, attention to the issue. As many people as you've ever seen are involved and engaged, and it's really exciting. You can get a win. And then with the fall, it starts to disintegrate a little bit, starts to fall apart, maybe movement tensions, some fighting, some pushback, some backlash. But hopefully you will get a good harvest. This is the time when you might pass big policies, for example, and I'll come to that in the next slide. And then in the winter, back down to defending and then renewing to hopefully start the cycle again. So this is a movement season full cycle from winter to winter. Now here's a plot also from the Ine Institute laying out these different seasons, and I doubt anyone can really read this, but you see these different key moments in this winter. I think it's Brown v. Board of Education, then you get the bus boycott, the Supreme Court forced schools to desegregate, we're getting warmer here, we're getting the March on Washington, this is full summer here, student sit-ins, freedom summer, freedom rides and arrests, the 24th Amendment, the 64 Civil Rights Act passes. This is this big triumphant moment, but then you get a couple more victories, and then King is assassinated, the Supreme Court rules in some difficult ways, and you get this sort of disintegration down after the winter. Now, on the movement level, just as at the individual level, people often experience the winter as just devastating because everyone was just caring about my issue. And we had tons of attention and energy. It was great, and everyone was in the streets. They all cared about it. And now they're not caring so much anymore. And now our organizations are starting to fall apart. And you could just feel like it's this big, depressing, disappointing failure. And part of what I'm trying to convey is that with the notion of the seasons, you could recognize, ideally, that you can get stuck in winter. The winter doesn't last forever. It's a stage before the next spring and the next summer. And in fact, you can use the winter to regenerate yourself, to learn from what you did, and then to move into the next season. So instead of seeing it as this incredibly depressing, disappointing thing, it's actually the jumping off point for the next cycle. And that awareness can help us relate very differently to the things going on, whether in our own individual lives or the organization or at the movement level. So then comes the question for this room, what season are you in? Raise your hand if you think you're in spring. So clever. Raise your hand if you think you're in summer. Okay. Raise your hand if you think you're in fall. And winter? Yeah, about even all the way through. So the reason I gave you those cards and those pencils is, if you like, as we're continuing to talk or after, there's an exercise you can do that you might enjoy where you write down the last, let's say, 10 years, just number like 23, 22, etc., and write down the biggest things that you can remember in your life. I got a dog, I lost my job, my sister got married, whatever, kind of things that just loom large in your mind. And you may start to see, and I certainly have when I've done this exercise, a pattern where you're like, oh, this is the season that I'm in, because you can start to see, 2017, banner year, everything was happening, everything was flowing, it was all great. That was clearly my summer, then there was a fall, then there was a winter. Sometimes the seasons can be like snap changed. For example, if you have a death in your family, you might go from summer to winter overnight. Movements can also experience this with 9/11. Really shut down very abruptly a lot of movement work, really like a hard turn shifted the country. So it doesn't always flow in this like natural, always happening progression, but I think they do tend to happen in sequence. Or you can argue with this and say my life isn't like that, and good for you. So, integration, chapter 3. How long till abolition? This is a runner who's very tired. So if you can imagine, sometimes working on big, important issues you feel like can be like a marathon. You're like running and running. How long till this like huge transformative change I'm trying to work for? It seems impossibly far away. It's exhausting. You can start to feel tired. Then you might feel bad for feeling tired because you should just maintain that summer energy forever until the end. Part of what Seasons is telling us is like, no, you don't summer your way to a major transformation that's going to take 50, 70 more years to come about. You have to go through seasons along the way.
Refresh.
Oh, thanks, Tom. So bringing back the movement map, I'm going to relate this to the next slide, so I'll just pop back and forth. In 2020, as we referred to, there were these huge protests. For a lot of people, maybe not the folks in this room, for a lot of people it was like, whoa, America, the world, this issue is hugely important. Racial justice is important, policing is important, mass incarceration is important. I hadn't been thinking about this before, and it's just like, all happening, a moment of the whirlwind. But there were all of these events in prior seasons leading up to that. So I would say, actually, there we go, I'm gonna use this slide. This is searches on Google for mass incarceration. This is 2004, this is 2010. It starts to go up, and the big spike is in 2020. But there was all this activity before then, kind of really kicking up around 2015, coincidentally when I started funding in this space. And here's where we are today. So I'll come back to this slide. You can see there's a lot going on before this big spike. If we use searches for mass incarceration as a kind of proxy for kind of interest, attention, engagement on the issue. And this slide explains some of what was going on. So I have a poster from Critical Resistance here. Some of you may be familiar. They've been working for years. I think they were founded in the late 90s, like working to get people to engage on this issue and recognize that millions and millions of people cycling in and out of jail and prison, being horribly treated and losing their families and their lives was unacceptable, and challenging that. That's Critical Resistance. Here's Mutual Aid, just one of a gazillion posters you could find online of people trying to develop practices around how to relate to each other, address conflict without the imposition of the sort of the state and the prison and policing. Here is, this is actually a poster, Hands Up, Don't Shoot. This is from Ferguson, 2014. That's not George Floyd. There were these spikes, if you remember. There was Ferguson, it was big, then it went down, then there were all these other horrible killings that got attention, more and more attention leading up to George Floyd. This is a picture of Norris Henderson. He's from Louisiana. He spent 27 years in Angola prison, wrongfully incarcerated, came out and founded an organization called Voice of the Experience in like 2005, and has been organizing and developing, as others have around the country. He's just the example I'm using, formerly incarcerated leaders organizing and developing policy to change laws and to get people out of prison. Here's Governor Pritzker from Illinois signing a big criminal justice reform bill. I think that was in 2018. Here's Bernie Sanders endorsed Larry Krasner for district attorney in Philadelphia. That was in 2017. I worked a lot on this election and sort of creating the conditions for it. Under Larry Krasner, the Philadelphia jail sort of plummeted pretty quickly by 40%, because the district attorney has a lot of power to decide to apply the laws differently than they were. Target wage theft instead of targeting poor people for low-level thefts and what have you. And since 2019, and this is a huge part in a way of what we need to be doing in this season, as I'll get to in a moment, reflecting back on what's been gained. Since 2009, there are now 24% fewer people in prison in the US. So even though the issue is still really important, it's still a really big problem, there's been all this progress and all of this kind of work more behind the scenes if you're not super close to the issue. So that when you see the people on the streets, you're like, oh my gosh, it's happening. Well, all of this stuff was already happening from the winter into the spring and leading up into that summer. These dots represent some, not all, of the district attorney races that I've worked on all over the country where we've had wins. Oakland, Los Angeles, Pima, just won Houston and Austin, that was really good. Minneapolis, Memphis, over in New York, Philly, all kinds of races, Boston. And I didn't have the kind of wherewithal or the time to do this, but I could have showed you a time lapse of like dot, 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 dot. And the dots are sort of piling up over time because more and more of these places are coming online and winning these elections. Elections definitely are not everything, but it's a sign of these more sort of structural changes happening. So then we get to 2020 and it all explodes. This is kind of a faint image, but this is from the New York Times showing how many people were in the streets, or how many different actions, I think it was, happening all over the country. Kind of this explosion of attention, energy, and interest, which was, for these types of folks, incredibly satisfying, because they've been working year after year after year to draw attention to the issue. And then finally they're getting it. This is fantastic, amazing, so exciting. But then we start to get backlash. But before we get to that, there's all of these harvests that come from Black Lives Matter. Not really going to go into it, but you can read about it. People can think, well, now there's been this backlash that I'll get to in a minute, and therefore this didn't really work. There's hundreds of law and policy changes and changes all across society that were sort of perpetuated by this mass explosion of attention and interest. So I'll just lob that at you and maybe answer questions about it if you like. This is the mass incarceration search slide again. And by the way, it's not just salience and attention and consciousness raising, it's also pushing for specific demands. We heard a lot about defund the police. We hear less about invest in communities. That was the partner demand to defund police. With very specific demands, this came out of, this is actually in upstate New York, but there were many similar things. Investing funds into mental health, non-carceral drug rehabilitation, renter protections, mobile crisis intervention, all of these sort of public health-oriented interventions that do in fact work much better to reduce crime if that's your goal. But remember, as we talked about in the beginning, that doesn't seem to be the actual goal. The actual goal seems to be to advance political careers using crime fear-mongering. So these are a bunch of solutions that many people choose to ignore and just focus on this part. And in fact, the evidence, there's so much evidence backing up these types of interventions, but there's two studies that I find interesting. One out of Boston, finding that people not arrested on misdemeanors actually do better in the long term, and crime is lower as a result, which is kind of hard for people to grasp. Wait, I thought if you don't hold people accountable, don't they do it more? Well, on a societal level, actually, people not arrested were 58% less likely to commit another crime than those who were charged and prosecuted. And you can imagine why. Because when you're arrested and prosecuted, the disruption to your life is really, really significant. In Cincinnati, there was a jail closure that forced like an immediate sort of shrinkage of how many people would get arrested because they had that many fewer beds, like a third fewer beds. And then crime fell. Even though everyone thought, crime's gonna skyrocket, we don't have the jail beds, it actually went down. So the demands were actually backed up by evidence. But did it matter? Not necessarily, given the political drive. So how do we go from this, which is a picture from DC of where the mayor had printed on the street, defund the police, who then jumps ahead a couple years and is pushing bills to incarcerate much more people. And then you get a lot of stuff like this. This is a cartoon from Minneapolis, showing, stereotypical crooks. Here the good news, Minneapolis dismantled the police department. And this becomes a sort of narrative. We go from a lot of people paying attention to racial justice and we need police accountability, we need less mass incarceration, to this. This is that coming into winter. This is actually a person who can't cross the street because it's so icy in England, but it makes a point. So sad. And I'm using this person in part because this street was easy to walk across before. It was great. We were crossing the street constantly, and now it's covered by ice and it's hard to make our way. And again, it's that sort of depressing feeling. Well, so what do we do in winter if that's where we are? And that is what I claim we are in mass incarceration work right now. We're in a winter, a warm one. I think that things could tick up again pretty easily. It's not a deep freeze. But if you're thinking of other issues you care about, you may feel like you're in more of a winter, and it's just really hard to get people's attention. So what do you do in winter? And the key three things are rest, reflect, and plan. And that's what I'm trying to encourage people to do now that I work with and whose work that I fund, is to actually look back and think, well, what has been accomplished in the last 10 years? Ferguson was 10 years ago this year in August. And how much has happened? A huge amount, in fact. So we need to kind of take it down a notch, acknowledge the kind of wins and changes that have happened, and even going back further to 2009, the nearly quarter drop in the prison population, and then think about, well, where do we go next? How do we plan for this next phase, this next cycle of movement? I'm coming to the end now. This very abstract thing that I created today, look how pretty it is. Okay, so imagine this is a full movement cycle. It's these sort of semicircles, 4 of them along the line. Let's say you're here and your big movement goal is here, like abolition or whatever it is you're trying to get to. It seems really hard and far away, and an endless summer marathon, be exhausting to try and get up the slope. Well, this says, think of it in terms of how many summers do you need to get to your goal? If you could really think in terms of long-term strategies, say, what should those summers be about in order to get to my goal? If I could just empress of the world and make everything happen, you could say, well, here was George Floyd. That was about racial justice. It was about police. It was about state use of force. What if the next one were about families and about children and family cohesion and the violence of separating families and how that should be unacceptable. And what if this one, you can sort of, there's many different kinds of things you could come up with. You'd be like, if we establish this part and then we establish the children part, what's the next thing we need to establish and the next in order to get to this big goal? And maybe it's not 4, maybe there's 10 of these jumps, or maybe only 3. Because major social change, can come quicker than you think. I don't know how many people in 1850 would have foreseen that within 15 years there would be abolition of slavery in the United States. Certainly a lot of people working towards that goal, but it seemed like, oh my God, you're going to transform the entire economy of the country. And, yes, we had a big civil war in the middle of it. It's part of it. Point being that the radical change doesn't necessarily need to wait forever. Okay, I'm just going to leave you with this notion that I want to bring it back down to the individual level to say that, to the extent that some of us struggle with our winters, or even to know what season we're in, a message of that, to know that you don't plant your seeds of your joy, of your victory in summer. Summer's too late to plant. If you plant in summer, you won't have enough sun time to get, okay, there's certain species, whatever, go with it. Don't plant a tomato in August. You need to plant it early so it has enough sun to get to where it's going. And this is some of, I don't even know what this is. Do you even know this plant? Thank you. I actually thought crocus and I assumed I was wrong. We're hearing crocus.
Okay.
Or what do you think it is, Deborah?
It's like a freesia, but...
Or freesia. We'll vote on that later. Point is that here it is, starting its early growth, just as the thaw is coming with the snow. So I'll leave you with that, and happy to take questions, and thanks for listening.
Yay!
Go ahead.
So, presumably the other side also has seasons.
Mm-hmm.
And would it ever make sense, supposing we're looking at the prison lobby, and we're in winter, but then they're in winter, can we get our act together and suddenly get into summer to take advantage of their winter energy?
Yes. So you could first of all, it's a metaphor, it's a framework. So you should it's not like a science, so you should play with it as you like. One way of looking at it is that you're in the opposite season to your opposition, because when you're winning, they're depressed, and when they're depressed, you're winning. It's like, another way though is to say they also have their own kinds of problems that they're struggling with, and absolutely strategically you want to sort of spot those. I'll give you one example. It used to be that all you had to do to win an election is send out a bunch of scary flyers, crime, and you win automatically. That's not happening right now. They're spending millions of dollars to put out the scary flyers, but in fact, for example, Jose Garza just won re-election in Austin. Comes out of labor, super radical, very cool, very smart guy. They put out the most disgusting, horrible ad, spent, I want to say, at least $3 million, probably more, to defeat him. He won by 65%. Their stuff isn't working anymore. And perhaps, if I could just think on my feet here, maybe you could say that they didn't do their winter work in 2020. They didn't pause, rest, reflect, and think about what they wanted to do next. Instead, they're using the same playbook over and over and over again from the 90s. And sometimes it's kind of working, and a lot of times it's not. It's definitely in the local election and state elections, Governor Beshear won re-election in Kentucky. That didn't seem particularly likely to happen. Kentucky's a red state. The Democrat won re-election, also smeared crime, danger, terrible. Virginia legislature, both of those happened in 2023. In 2022, a lot of us in this work were like, we may be about to fall off a cliff with these midterms. Because if the Democrats lose the House by a ton, which is normal and sort of predicted in the midterms, it'll be blamed on us. It'll be blamed on defund, on mass incarceration and crime. That's why the Democrats lost. But as you know, they lost the House, but by 4 seats. They did, and it's really New York State's fault. We can have a whole conversation about that. But in Michigan and Minnesota and a lot of these states, actually people voted, we seem to think, on abortion, and they were like, yeah, I hear that crime stuff, but I'm worried about crime, but I'm not loving the prison and policing thing. It feels complicated, but I do really care about abortion. Point being, we survived 2022, and I think that shows that we're kind of on the upward slope. It's not as salient and big and everything and flowing and winning the way it was in 2020 and the sort of in 2021, there has been some retrenchment, but again, the other side's tactics and strategies aren't working as well. So I hope that they don't watch this presentation and don't learn about it until we can learn and outmaneuver and outflank them. Like Lord of the Rings style.
You made a point really in passing that I would love for you to unpack a little bit. You said the district attorneys can choose to prosecute things that, count as crimes. And, I wasn't as aware until I started talking to you how arbitrary what counts as a crime is and how often that's just kind of attacking people for being poor and not necessarily for some objective criminal act. And can you just give us a few more examples of that sort of thing that happens where we might not be aware that there's other types of dangerous criminals out there that aren't getting the attention they deserve, maybe?
So there's a lot packed into there. First, you need to know that there's a set of things there's a whole bunch of things that are harmful to society, very, very harmful. And many of them are not made illegal in the statutes. For example, a lot of environmental pollution might be a regulatory fine, but not a criminal act, just to take that kind of thing. So you could say, this is causing a ton of harm. It's actually causing a lot of deaths. A lot of people, who run people over in their cars are not prosecuted and sent to prison because we sort of allow for cars in our society. There's a whole other kind of discussion I've been getting into lately. What do we focus on? In New York, a lot of people are talking a lot about crime in the subway. It's very rare, like you have a 1 in a million chance, literally, of being victim of crime in the New York subway, but people are obsessing over it right now, part of because of the media coverage, and yet people are getting mowed over by cars all the time in Brooklyn, including kids, like the cars, like big grills, and they sort of mow over a kid. But no one's talking about that. So what is present in our mind is like, where does the threat come from? And is it what we call put into the crime bucket? And are those things in the statutes? So all of that is well even before we're getting to what is the DA prosecuting, which are things that society considers crimes and they're in the statutes. Okay, so they have all these statutes. First of all, they can't prosecute unless there's an arrest. The DA doesn't just go out and pick people up. So if the police aren't arresting, they're not prosecuting. Sometimes the police will be like, they'll blame the DA for lack of arrests, which are literally their job. This happened a lot in San Francisco, for example, and in other places. Police act kind of like a protection racket. We can come back to that. They can only prosecute what comes to them, but there's a lot of things that might come to them. They have to decide how to allocate the resources of their office. So do you want to put the limited number of lawyers that you have, really focusing on prosecuting to the hilt and taking to trial and really pushing these drug possession cases? Or do you really want to go hard on and investigate other types of things, including wage theft? So there are choices that they can make, and their discretion is pretty much unreviewable. If they don't charge, there's no review for that, although the state attorney general can oftentimes come in and prosecute them as a state matter rather than a local matter. This is getting very technical. But so there's a huge array of stuff that's at the prosecutor's discretion, and this is why we put a lot of attention and money and resources into changing who those people are. That work, by the way, came out of the death penalty work. For years, people were litigating. You may have heard of Bryan Stevenson. Who's heard of Bryan Stevenson? Oh, most people haven't. Bryan Stevenson, Bryan with a Y. Look up his TED Talk. It might make you cry. It always makes me cry. He's a litigator from Alabama who's been working for years and years to defend people accused to get them off death row. People who did what they were accused of, by the way. These aren't innocence cases. But he famously, at least famous to me, says, the question isn't whether someone deserves to die, it's whether we deserve to kill. And in this country with a legacy of slavery, the answer to that should be no. So it was really coming out of that work, there was all this litigation to try to stop these death penalty cases, and then some of us teamed up to say, well, what if we just removed the deadliest DAs who are bringing the most death penalty cases? Because by the way, some places would prosecute tons of death penalty cases and others none. It is arbitrary which side of the county line you're on, let alone whether your racial background is also going to be a huge determinant. But based on which DA, sometimes which judge is really going to determine whether you live or die, which gets at sort of most intensively displays the fundamental arbitrariness of this enforcement. Other question?
I got a question. Do you feel the traditional political party system as it is right now, is it helpful or is it not helpful? Does it need to get shuffled around in order for you to accomplish kind of what you envision and goal is? Was it a big mess?
That feels like he's asking if the traditional party structure is helpful or unhelpful. I mean, I'll just answer it this way. Maybe, I don't know if I'm getting to the point of your question. The Democratic Party has not been historically fantastic on this issue. In fact, in the 90s, it was Bill Clinton who passed the 94 crime bill, which led to a huge spike in the number of people in prison and made it much harder for people to appeal death cases and so on. So Democrats and Republicans have worked very tightly together on this issue for a while. Then they started to then there was a reform-oriented convergence in the aughts, in the early teens, where Republicans and Democrats were like, mass incarceration is a problem, it's really expensive, we need to work together to reduce it. Then post-George Floyd, I'd say there's been a divergence, where Democrats generally are gonna want to hew towards being more progressive on this, with major exceptions, like the Democrat mayor of New York City, whose problem, Mayor Adams. But generally speaking, you're getting Democrats more saying we need to reduce incarceration, and Republicans now, the MAGA Republicans, I mean, a lot of Republicans pushed out of the party, MAGA Republicans, are build more prisons quicker, faster, they're fantastic. And it's all like ludicrous nonsense. Like the new governor of Louisiana just signed all these bills where they're going to massively increase the population. There's literally nowhere to put them. Like the sheriff of New Orleans is like, I cannot house the people who are going to be flooding into our system. And by the way, the jail is already under consent decree for being in terrible conditions, and they should close parts of it. And now thanks to the governor's bill, they're just going to be sending floods of people in. I don't think the governor even cares about that. The point is he can say, I took care of your safety. I mean, it makes no sense. It's all a kind of weird game. So, but I don't know if that reaches the breadth of your question, but I'd say like the party politics, sometimes we ride them and sometimes we fight them. Yeah.
I'm just, okay, as I'm listening to you, thank you very much for speaking. Thinking about this internally in the United States versus globally, and military prisons, and U.S. force being like essentially the world's police. What are your thoughts about this dynamic in the international scene?
So first I'll say I am very much an U.S.-based expert, and I would love to know more about the criminal justice policies. Hello, doggy. Are you lost? Internationally, and I don't know that much. I will tell you this one anecdote, though. I was interested in maybe getting involved in supporting work elsewhere if I could find donors who would be interested. And I asked around for people who knew about international criminal justice work, and I spoke to someone at Grassroots International, which is a great organization supporting movement work all over the world. And they were like, yeah, we don't really talk about criminal justice reform in other countries because in all the places we work, at least, she said, it's not really a question. It's like very obvious to everyone that it's like prison and jail are used oppressively to target certain disfavored groups, and that's why they exist. And no one is like having these consternated discussions around, well, crime and safety, but also discrimination, and I feel so torn the way various liberals here in the US are. In the context she was referring to, it's just like, yeah, it's authoritarian state power targeting certain disfavored groups. So what it means to do, so they don't have criminal justice reform in other places, she was saying. I'm excerpting Europe here, which I think would be a little different. She's like, we just have human rights. And that was kind of an interesting thing for me to contemplate, because we rarely talk about, as you probably know, human rights in this country. It's like human rights are for other countries. Here we have all the rights. Not true. And I'll also say, we have been, as a country, exporting this sort of prison governing through prisons to other countries for years, and the incarceration rates are stepping up in places like Brazil and England, Australia. They're way behind us. So the US is still the worst incarcerator, but the trajectory is not great. There's a academic called B.A.Z. Dressinger, who did a book, going to prisons all over the world and looking at these dynamics that you might want to check out.
Leo.
Okay, so this has been amazing, thank you. Do you think because the politicians that are signing these bills, that are enabling these things to happen, are motivated by the corporate lobbies funding them, do you think that public opinion alone could change this model that's ultimately profit driven? Because it's beyond even the political leaders and getting them elected. It's like, in order for them to write policies that someone can own and operate a prison and get like the slave labor from it. You know what I mean?
Right. I would dispute the premise of what you're saying a little bit. But I would say, so she's asking about can public opinion shifts really do the job given the sort of corporate interests that are propelling this?
Yes.
I would say the extent to which corporate interests are propelling this, I would have a different view on how much they are propelling it. There is slave labor in prisons. We do have the 13th Amendment, which you may know or may not know, abolishes slavery except upon having been convicted of a crime. So in the Constitution, slavery okay if you're incarcerated, basically, which is kind of wild. Various states, Colorado, Alabama, weirdly, and others have changed the 13th Amendment to exclude that provision, to sort of, there's work going on now to explicitly tackle prison slavery. I would say a couple of things. First, I want to say most, but I'm not confident in that. A huge chunk of prison labor is not actually for for-profit companies, it's for the prison itself. So the state doesn't have to pay to have janitors in the prison because the workers do it. The workers run the kitchen. The workers are even doing some guard work. The prisoners. The prisoners are doing all that work, so the state is getting its prison for cheap, and it becomes this own self-perpetuating cycle. And even in Louisiana, when there was criminal justice reforms a few years ago, the sheriff was like, they're letting out our best guys. I need those guys. I need them in here to do this work. And in fact, there's even still convict leasing. There was a great ProPublica article recently about this. In Mississippi, leasing out people to work in local businesses, to mow lawn. It's bananas. Okay, so a lot of the labor is not actually for-profit labor. There is a chunk that is for-profit labor. In my experience doing lobbying work and working on these bills, the other side of the table was not some company. It was the Sheriff's Association, the District Attorneys Association, the corrections unions, and the police unions. In part because they want, the more prisons and jail, more people there are in prisons and jails, the more people need to exist to police them, and therefore the strength of their union grows. So that is who's on the other side of this. I'd also say the kind of capital being produced here is not just financial capital, but as I was alluding to, is political capital. So by harping on crime or creating a crime fear, you can almost, I call it like printing free political capital for yourself. You can just significantly increase your chances of winning the election just based on making these kinds of accusations about, the state of our city. It's in such crazy disarray. Mayor Adams actually has a problem now because he was like, a total crime fest in New York. It's terrible, but that actually keeps tourists away. So he's like, actually, no, it's fine. It's fine. Really bizarre to see that go down.
But isn't that a perfect example of the relationship between the marketplace and policing / sort of the ideology or the ideology of crime? Because in New York, we have the Hudson Yards, we have all of these developers wanting to develop Penn Station, all these big money projects. And in order to get that done, Mayor Adams is sort of allowing houseless people to take over Penn Station, to create the image that this is so infested, we need to take this down and build this whole metroplex of luxury, whatever the fuck. And it's like, he's owned by them. Mayor Adams is owned by the real estate lobby, one of the owners. You know what I mean?
So I think that I love that you're bringing this up. I'm coming up on time, so you're totally correct on that. And that is a helpful expansion from this sort of prison slave labor aspect to this broader set of interests at play and where are the money interests and which way are they going. But to answer the question you put to me, does changing public opinion have any effect on that? Absolutely it does. If, in New York City, jaywalking's a crime, but it's not a crime. And just take a really simple, little, easy one. You cross the street when, as long as you're hopefully not gonna get run over, people jaywalk all the time because culturally it is just accepted that that's what you do in New York. And if someone tried to arrest you for it, you could probably be like, what are you talking about? What is happening? This is ridiculous. It is unaccepted. Similarly, heroin possession in New York, it used to be a big deal, much less now. Compared to Louisiana, you can get a 7-year prison sentence for it. The meaning of that changes place to place based on the sort of, not just the laws, but the culture around it. And that actors like judges and DAs and police feel the pressure of that culture. So a big shift in public opinion is also sort of a shift in the culture and also how the media and everything talks about it. So that is a bigger topic, but thank you for raising it. At the end, I'm over time. I'm gonna stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe.